Hi, Halth-Leah Halth-Leah Queen Krishamin, Kayah George Queen Sna, Tanachin-Cla, Tulalip and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, Skulus Man, Sitsailta Shan Jishab, Unhotland Squalwin Teets. Hi everybody, I just introduced myself in my traditional language. My name is Kayah George. I'm from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation and Tulalip tribes. Tsleil-Waututh is located in North Vancouver, Canada, and Tulalip is just north of Seattle, Washington. And I said also in my language, it lifts my heart to be here speaking. And I typically like to start my introduction and start speaking in my language because that's our tradition, and I actually just recently learned my language. It was almost a dead language. There's currently around 30 to 40 people that could speak it in the world right now, so I have to go to university to learn it. So it's something I try and use very often, and I hold very dear to my heart. And as I said, my name is Kayah George, and I am an Indigenous youth activist, and I've been fighting for our lands and waters in North Vancouver for about half my life. I'm 21 years old now, and when industry first started encroaching on our traditional territories, I was around 11 years old. And this is something I feel as though I've inherited from my family, the duty and the obligation to protect the land and the water. Because as I said, around 10 years ago, there were people that came to my nation, and they told us they want to build a pipeline that goes through a lot of Indigenous territories, and it'll increase the tanker traffic on our waters that our people sit on by 7-fold. And that's something that my people thought about, and they considered very carefully how an increase in tanker traffic not only increases the chances of a catastrophic spill exponentially, but we don't want oil tankers going through our most holy and our most sacred place on earth. As we say for the inlet that my Tsleil-Waututh people reside on, that's our oldest grandmother. And it's our duty to have that reciprocal relationship to protect her and to care for her the same way that she cares for us. We're supposed to defend her. We have a saying, when the tide is out, the table is set. We have all the food, we have everything we need that comes from that water. And so when that came forward to us, not only did Tsleil-Waututh Nation have 100% consensus no, but we decided to actively oppose it and create a 1,200-page assessment on why, using our spiritual laws as well as a team of researchers and scientists, to say why. There's many reasons why we oppose oil in our territory, namely being its impacts on our future generations as well. And we've made it a point to say we're not anti-industry, we're not anti-economy, we're just anti-destruction of our earth, desecrating the land. And that's something that we hold so dear to us, especially that piece of water right there. That's everything we have. At the time of contact, the Tsleil-Waututh people, we were once 15,000, and we were wiped down to 13 people, and the remaining 500 of us are descendants of those 13 people. So we have this strong connection to what we hold, what we have left, and what we hold most dear to us. And that's our future, and that's our past, and that's our present. Everything we have is on that water right there. So of course we're gonna do absolutely everything we can to protect it. And I'll say, since we've been opposing the pipeline, since since the day one, since we started opposing it 10 years ago, not a single pipeline has been built on traditional Tsleil-Waututh territory. And as I say, as long as we keep fighting, not a single one will be built on our traditional territory. We've had help from our allies. We've had help from people all across the globe who came and supported us. A few years back, we created a watch house. It's a traditional form of protecting ourselves. We created a small longhouse to look out on the industry coming into our territory, and we've had people come from all over the world. We even had a march with over 10,000 people marching with us across all around the watch house. And with that shared solidarity and support, the movement's grown huge in Vancouver. It's hard to find somebody who doesn't know about what's going on and how the entire city, most of the city, is opposing this pipeline and standing in solidarity with Tsleil-Waututh Nation, Squamish Nation, and the Indigenous people that sit along the pipeline. And this has been a movement that's been growing so much. But one thing that we always center ourselves in, and we always keep this, it sets a tone of peace and it sets a tone of where our hearts are and why we're opposing this, is we've always connected what we're doing back to spirituality and back to our culture and back to our back to who we are as a people. So you'll see even in our marches and in our actions, you'll see us singing our traditional songs and holding our medicines and praying, always leading in prayer. Because as we say, this battle is no longer fought with weapons, but it's fought with prayers and it's fought with words. And that's something we always try and center ourselves in. And I'm really happy for that fact that I've been able to be a part of this in such a peaceful way so far. And it's something that I know that we all hold so dear to all hold so dear to our hearts. We've been working so hard for restoration of our land and the restoration of our culture, restoration of our natural resources, of our food, of our language. And it would be a shame to see that all go to waste and to see an oil spill happen. We've been working for, I don't want to age my dad, but since my dad was a child, they haven't been able to get clams out of our inlet, out of our water. And for the first time in decades, I'll just say like 30 years, we were able to get clams out of our inlet and eat them. And we're able to show my dad, he was telling me, he's like, we haven't been able to do that since I was really small. And I was afraid that my kids wouldn't be able to appreciate and like look at the land and use it the way that I did as a child. I was afraid it was gone. A lot of our traditions were gone, and it makes me so happy that we're able to finally test our water and make sure it's clean enough to eat out of. And we've worked so hard for this. So let's work very hard to keep it. Let's use everything we have to keep it and everything we have to preserve it. And when we do this, we do it in a good heart. We do it with love in our hearts, because what we're doing is for love. What we're doing is protecting the land for our future generations because we love them. We're protecting it for all of humanity because we have love in our hearts for all of our humanity and all of our as we call them, our brothers and sisters, our two-legged, our finned, our winged, all the animals that live around us. We're doing it for the ones who don't have voices. And so that's why sometimes I'll get nervous before I speak somewhere, and my dad and my grandma, they'll tell me, do this for the ones who can't speak. You have to spread this message of why it's so important to us, of why we're opposing these pipelines, and why you see so many Indigenous people standing up together, fighting with everything they have to protect the land and protect the water. And it's for the love of it. It's for our ancestors. It's for our future generations. And especially our grandmother, the inlet, we look at her, we look at that water as a relative. We look at her as the oldest grandmother. As it was told to me, our Tsleil-Waututh people come from the water. And it started off with the first Tsleil-Waututh man walking along the beach, and he prayed for a partner. He prayed not to be alone. He prayed to Creator, and Creator heard his prayers. And he had this urge to go dive deep into the inlet and grab 2 handfuls of sediment, 2 handfuls of the essence of the inlet, all the sand, and he grabbed it and he put it on the beach. He put cedar branches on it, and he fell asleep in the hot sun. And when he woke up, there was the first Tsleil-Waututh woman, grandmother, laying right next to him. And when I first heard that story, I was like, Dad, why does the girl have to be mud? Why can't it be the other way around? Like, the woman creates the man. And I was like, I don't want to be mud. And my dad was like, no, don't, you have to understand, we're all descended from her. We're all, all the boys, all the girls, all of us, every single person you know in our family, we're descended from her. We're all a part of her because that's our grandma. And as we say in my language, ta'a. So when you see your grandma, when you see your ta'a and you feel that love for her, that's the love we have to feel for our water. And that's why we have to protect her. You know, you would protect ta'a or your grandma with if somebody was trying to hurt her. And it's funny that I say that because my grandmother's been fighting alongside with us, alongside my dad, my brother, and my whole family. And she's been arrested 3 times protecting our lands and water. So she's really tough. She's one of the toughest activists I know. And she's this little sweet old lady. But it just goes to show we'll do anything to protect it. And towards the end of this this event, I'll share some resources on how you can learn more and how you can support Tsleil-Waututh Nation and many other nations in their fight opposing oil and extraction through their territories. And with that, I want to say thank you for listening to me. Haichka in my language. This is thank you. Haichka. I raise my hands.
Thank you so much, Kayah. That was an incredibly powerful and moving intervention, which I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that will be with me for a long time, and an incredible demonstration of how there aren't 2 fights for climate and social justice. There is one, and Indigenous peoples such as yourself have always been and will always be on the front lines of that fight, and look forward to hearing more later on about how we can stand in solidarity. And seeing from I'm not alone in that. Our next speaker is Adrienne Buller. Tough act to follow, Adrienne, but I'm sure you'll smash it. Adrienne is a senior research fellow at the think tank Commonwealth, where she leads the Green New Deal research program. Previously, she led the finance project at InfluenceMap, investigating the intersections between climate change and the financial system. So Adrienne's going to talk a little bit about her work and where things are at the current moment, given the pandemic, the oil crash, and what that means for activists such as ourselves. I'm going to spotlight you, Adrienne. And hopefully you're unmuted. If not, I will unmute you.
Does that work? Yes. Okay. Hello, everyone. I just want to say as well, thank you, Kayah. That is a really tough act to follow. It's really beautiful words. And as someone who was fortunate enough to grow up on your lands in Vancouver, thank you for everything that you do to defend it. Yeah, eternally indebted. As Angus said, I'm going to take things in a slightly different direction and talk a little bit about how fossil fuels are sort of kept propped up by the financial system as it currently operates, and just sort of walk through some of the systemic flows there. And then end a little bit on what I think we can do about it, which probably is a good transition to Anne, who's the eternal source of knowledge on that. So I guess when we think of big sort of systemic targets for tackling climate change, the first thing that comes to mind is sort of iconic images of the oil majors, Exxon's, BP's. And while those are undoubtedly worthy targets, in focusing on them, you quickly run up against a lot of challenges. You know, for starters, it's impossible in a lot of ways for us to personally remove fossil fuels in our lives because our economy has been built to be so structurally dependent on them. It's also, you know, incredibly difficult to win when you're telling a company to effectively end itself or to undertake a transformation into an entirely new business, say green energy. It's not impossible to do so. There are some examples of that happening, but it's a huge uphill battle. And, you know, while we have to keep fighting these incredibly important battles against pipelines and other projects that Kayah and people have led, you know, the hard truth is that these companies keep finding new projects and new ways to degrade the environment and to extract fossil fuels. And this kind of resistance, you know, takes an immense toll on activists, and the burden shouldn't always have to fall on people who have to immediately defend their lives and livelihoods. So something that we can do, at least, you know, in the UK and in this group in particular, to try and exercise some power over the system, is to look at cutting fossil fuel extraction off at, you know, its upstream source, at the origin of what enables these companies to keep doing this. And that takes you immediately to the financial system. And to borrow a quote from Bill McKibben, you know, money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns. And I think that really represents what we're talking about here, which is, you know, an underlying system that enables all of this to keep happening. So briefly talk about finance and the financial system. And I'm not talking about government finances here, just sort of private finance. So in the most sort of abstract theoretical terms that you learn in sort of economics 101, financial system is, you know, meant to be this neutral arbiter that enables the most efficient allocation of funds and money in the economy based on market forces, and that's supposed to arrive at a just outcome. We all know that unregulated markets are incredibly destructive, and acting as though finance is neutral and is best left to its own devices is effectively taking what is a public good, which is, you know, credit creation, and delegating it to the control of sort of private authorities with virtually no democratic accountability. And you know, this has wrought severe consequences, with the most obvious being continued investment in fossil fuels, despite overwhelming consensus that we need to keep, you know, something like close to 90% of remaining fossil fuels in the ground to have even a hope of staying within 1.5 degrees Celsius. So obviously, the fossil fuel industry is profoundly dependent on the financial system for its continued existence. And while the Divest Barclays campaign, of course, focuses on a major bank, the financial system involves a huge array of players. So I'll just briefly run through some of those. And banks are huge here. You know, they provide credit to these companies to enable further extractive and exploratory activities. They fund individual projects like tar sands, like pipelines. Chase Bank is the worst offender in the world here, but Barclays takes home the top slot in the UK, so yay. You also have insurance companies, which carry risk for these companies, enable the projects to go ahead. That's sort of a pivotal and often overlooked element, is that none of these projects could even begin without an insurer saying that they'll assume that risk. And finally, you have, which is my personal focus, asset managers. These are groups like BlackRock and Legal & General, who manage money for other people. You probably manage your pension fund if you have one. And they buy equity in companies, and increasingly important, they buy up corporate bonds, which is another kind of debt that companies can issue to fund their activities. And this group in particular has grown like tremendously in power and importance over the past few decades, and particularly since the last financial crisis. So debt is really the fuel on the fire here, in the form of loans and corporate bonds. It's enabled these companies, aided by billions in government subsidy annually, to continue unabated. And crucially, it is really vital in allowing them to pursue forms of increasingly costly and incredibly destructive extraction, like tar sands, Arctic oil exploration, and fracking. It also allows them to do this while continuing to pay out, record dividends to shareholders. So one thing that the divestment movement has been incredibly effective in doing is sort of stigmatizing investment in these companies. And as a result, they have increased dividend payouts over time, which is sort of a sweetener that is a justification for asset managers to remain invested in these companies a lot of times. And when we're talking about bank loans, I'm sure you've all seen the stat that, in the past 5 years, global banks have funneled about $2 trillion to fossil fuel projects. That's massive, but investment from asset managers is also hugely significant in the form of corporate bonds, and I don't think receives as much scrutiny as it should. But it's not just, for me, the actual sort of dollars and cents of asset managers that's scariest. For me, it's that there's an increasing concentration of power and wealth in that sector. So increasingly, the largest asset managers are scooping up more and more assets, taking up more and more power in these companies, and having massive sway over the direction of the economy, and particularly continued investment in fossil fuels. So there's sort of three major asset management giants. You've got BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And one of these three companies is the biggest single shareholder in 450 out of the 500 S&P 500 companies. And that's a level of concentration that's only going to increase. And that list includes oil majors like Exxon and Chevron. And so they have an immense amount of control over the companies in which they're invested. They're also a huge signal to the rest of the market. So when BlackRock buys oil, everyone else will keep buying oil, in part because they use a type of investing that is called index tracking funds and passive investing, which basically just tracks this abstract index, and everyone else sort of follows suit. They're also increasingly influential when it comes to sort of the regulation of the global financial system. They're incredibly effective lobbyists. And BlackRock, in particular, in the context of this crisis, is a really good example of this. So they have sort of, in terms of profit, a much smaller part of their business, but in terms of impact, a huge part of their business, which is sort of consulting. And so in the US, the Federal Reserve just sort of granted BlackRock the sort of control of its corporate debt purchasing program. This happened in 2008 in the financial crisis. It contributed massively to BlackRock's ascendant to global dominance. And it's a huge conflict of interest, and it just gives them massive control over how our ability to rebuild from this crisis will go, what will happen with investment in fossil fuels or green energy. And so that's massively influential. They're also selected to advise the European Commission on sustainable finance rules through their consulting arm. Something, again, which is a huge conflict of interest, given that they've lobbied against this kind of regulation in the past, and probably has something to do with revelation. I think yesterday that the current draft of the EU sustainable finance regulation doesn't have oil or gas in its definition of fossil fuels. So that, I guess, is fine. And all of this sort of is just set to continue with a couple major players with zero transparency, really, no democratic accountability, just sort of a black box, having incredible control over the entire economy, and in particular, fossil fuels. So what can we demand? What can we do? The biggest theme for me is just subjecting the financial system to democratic contestation, making it publicly accountable. Banks have the right to create credit and to conduct their activities because the public grants them that right. This is something that is legislatively defined, and therefore, that power comes from us, and it should be subject to contestation. So targeting individual banks, as Divest Barclays has done, is really an important step, and I think has accomplished a lot. But sort of targeting the system more broadly, and regulation of the system, and demanding transparency and accountability more broadly is, I think, a really essential step. Asset managers, they manage our money overwhelmingly through our pension funds. Again, that's something that they have no accountability to us. We often have no idea what's in our investments. A lot of people in the UK, you might be invested in Nest, which is sort of the biggest government-backed pension scheme. For me, it's a good example. I'm invested in Nest, and I chose to take the climate-aware option, and I was only able to access the top 5 holdings of that, even though it's my money invested in it. And holding number 5 was ExxonMobil of the Climate Aware Fund. So, and I had to try really hard to find that. So there's just zero transparency, and there's no one that I can turn to and say, you know, I'm trying to make a choice to invest responsibly. This is unacceptable. It's our money, you know, we're looking at it in the long term. It's our future and our planet, and we should have the opportunity to demand that our money is used in a way that represents our values and destroy our collective future. So demanding pension fund reform, I think, would be really powerful. It's a huge amount of money that is ours, and we should have collective say over it. And yeah, I guess all that to say that the financial system is a really powerful tool for good or for evil. But ultimately, you know, the ability to create credit, to invest, allows us to do incredible things. And, you know, will necessarily enable us to invest in clean energy and transform our economies. But all of these parts of the financial system ultimately derive their power from us. And it's time that we reclaim that and made them serve the common good and our collective futures. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. That was incredibly informative. I think if Kayah laid out for us the web of life that her peoples have been fighting for, that was really laying out the web of capital and the web of finance. That's just important to understand our enemy, to be fighting it on several fronts. Is absolutely true that, you know, this Divest Barclays campaigns targets one bank, and it targets that one bank because it's the biggest financer of fossil fuels in Europe. But then also, we can't just be limiting ourselves to banks. We need to be looking at this wider financial system and how that underpins the fossil industry, how that underpins extractivism. And I think that then takes us, you know, quite neatly on to figure out how we can have a financial system that does serve the common good. You know, and yeah, be interesting. And Anne was one of the few to predict the great financial crisis of 2008 in the coming first world debt crisis. I think you'll be forgiven, Anne, for you know, not having written a book about this latest one, but one's enough. In 2008, she jointly co-authored the original the Green New Deal platform with the New Economics Foundation, which has gained a lot of traction recently on both sides of the Atlantic. In 2017, she published The Production of Money on the Nature of Money, Debt and Banking. Her 2019 book, The Case for the Green New Deal, was published in 2019. In 2018, the Heinrich Böll Foundation awarded Anne the Hannah Arendt Prize, and the University of Newcastle awarded her an honorary doctorate for leading an international movement for the cancellation of $150 billion of debt owed by 35 poor countries, the Jubilee 2000. Anne's going to be talking a little bit about yeah, that alternative financial system and her vision for the Green New Deal that she's been writing and talking about. So I will spotlight you, Anne. And hopefully
so much, Angus. First of all, I'm absolutely thrilled to be on this this webinar. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the early campaigns against apartheid, and I want to salute People and Planet for your role in that, and to say to all the people working and campaigning now that that helped to bring about a massive transformation. And your campaign was I remember very vividly the Barclays disinvestment campaign. I remember very vividly the students that used to go into Barclays banks and come out again and then lock the doors behind them with bicycle chains, and then have all the kerfuffle of the police and so on to kind of get that sorted. It was so impactful and so powerful, and I'm really grateful for that. And can I say that it's a tremendous honor to follow Kayah and Adrienne. Kayah's presentation was deeply moving. You know, it was so wonderful to hear her speak in her own language, and to hear her honor her mother, her grandmother. As a grandmother myself, I felt tremendously moved by that. And Adrienne is one of my heroines. She's brilliant at what she does, and you know, I can't praise her work enough. It's really doing a lot of good. Finally, can I salute you, Angus, and People and Planet, for having 3 women on the platform. As an old lady myself, I can't tell you how revolutionary that is. You know, back in the day, when I was Adrienne's age, you would be very lucky to get 1 woman on the platform. So well done to you. I want to talk about my big thing is that my big issue is that it's really hard for us to talk about tackling climate breakdown, Earth systems breakdown, without talking about the financial system and about how closely integrated they are. And as Adrienne said, that money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns, Bill McKibben's famous quote. And we've got to do something about that oxygen, in order to do something about the planet burning. And I wanted to just say how extraordinary this moment is that we're living through at the moment too, because it's revealing to us very clearly the kind of very powerful link between money and oil, essentially. And the story that I'm absolutely hit up about at the moment is the story of the dollar, the power of the dollar. Now, you may not know, but I was born in South Africa and I grew up in South Africa. I left a long time ago, but my heart is still there, of course, and my family is still there. And I've just watched in these last few weeks as they began to tackle this huge threat of a pandemic, with millions of people unemployed, with millions of low-income people, with a very inadequate health system that they inherited from the apartheid days. And the first thing that happened was investors, creditors, and speculators took their money and whooshed out of the country overnight. And what that did was to crash their currency, and it increased the value of the dollar. Now, in the way the international system works, you can't buy oil or copper or soya beans with South African rands. You've got to have dollars, right? And the dollars just washed out of their country, stampeded out of their country, right? So that immediately increased the value of the dollar. It crashed their currency. It increased the cost of their debt held in dollars. But at the same time, commodity prices collapsed. So their chance of earning income to deal with that debt was reduced by the fact that commodity prices collapsed through no fault of South Africa or of any of those low-income countries. It was the system, and it was the pandemic for which they couldn't be blamed, right? But nevertheless, that's what happened. And then Western rating agencies moved into town and said, oh dear, you've got a problem with your currency, the devaluation of your currency. We're going to downgrade your status with creditors, with investors. Immediately, of course, investors had to leave, pension funds had to leave. Immediately, that increased their borrowing costs, their ability to borrow in the first place, and secondly, their borrowing costs. Do you know, this catastrophe was happening to them as at the same moment, a virulent bug had invaded the country and was threatening the health of the people, and the economy was going to go down, as we've seen all around us. Now, we have had to face that pandemic, but we haven't had to face these extraordinary circumstances which had absolutely nothing to do with South Africa as such. So that makes me feel very agitated about the role of the system, the financial system, and its link to oil. And the link to oil comes in here. In 1973, it's little known that in 1973, the dollar had fallen, mainly because the United States had built up a deficit and was engaged in the Vietnam War and wasn't really meeting her obligations. But that meant that oil revenues fell for the big oil producers, particularly the Saudis, the Middle Eastern oil producers. Simultaneously, the Israelis launched a war, the Yom Kippur War, it's known as. And so what the Saudis did was they quadrupled the price of oil, right? They pushed it up 4 times what it was. And this, of course, was incredibly damaging for the United States and for countries of the world. But Saudi Arabia and other oil producers were kind of protecting themselves from the fall in the value of the dollar, which was not anything of their responsibility. So what happened was President Nixon sent a delegation across to Saudi Arabia, and the deal was, excuse me, can we have a very secret discussion here? If you lower the price of oil, and if you do as we say, essentially, is what his Kissinger's and his people said to the Saudis, then we will give you military backing. We will back you to the hilt, right? And in return, you must insist that all payments for oil are made in US dollars, right? So the deal was simply this, that in return for military protection for Saudi Arabia from Israel and from her other enemies, in return for that military protection, Saudi Arabia would arrange for all payments for oil to be channeled into the United States' treasury, right? To help the United States pay its deficit, to live beyond its means, right? And that is still the case today, nearly 40 years, more than 40 years later, right? And interestingly, only a couple of days ago, today there's a Bloomberg report of the Saudi prince, because he's not a king, who now is messing up all kinds of things in the Middle East, taking a call from President Trump. And Trump said to him, "You're messing around by dumping oil on the oil markets, on the global oil markets. That's hurting my local fracking sector, and that's messing up the global economy. Prices falling. This is dreadful. You've got to cut production." And of course, the prince was reluctant to do that because he was the dumping of oil on the global markets was precisely to target the American fracking sector, right? At which point, according to the Bloomberg report today, and it could just be gossip, what happened then was the Saudi prince told his the people around him, his advisors, to leave the room. Because what Trump said to him was, if you don't cut production of oil today, I will withdraw all military support for Saudi Arabia. There'll be a bill in the House, in the Congress, and we'll just withdraw our military support. And of course, Saudi Arabia is in the middle of a war in Yemen against Iran, essentially. And so he bullied this prince into agreeing to cut production. Now, you know, it's all interesting gossip and it's all fascinating geopolitics, but what it shows you is the kind of incredible tie there is between oil and the dollar and the United States' deficit, right? And so what I would like campaigners to do, and it's very hard to do this, is not just to, and I'm very proud of you and your work on Barclays, and you've got to keep that up. Absolutely got to keep it. Because can I just say you that after the apartheid campaign, I met a PR, a woman who worked in public relations for Barclays, and she spelled out to me when it was all over how absolutely agonizing and awful it had been for the bank and what an impact it had. So, you know, don't stop doing that. But if we can think systemically, that would help a lot, because the left and, you know, people and Greens and all of those sorts of good progressive people tend to think in a micro way about what's happening on our doorstep. Well, of course, that's terribly important. And of course, it matters to us enormously. But we also need to understand that we live within a system, right? Like the ecosystem, it's there. That system has to be thought of, not just the effect of that system on us here. And the system, the international financial system, which ensures that the US dollar is the world's reserve currency and that poor countries have no choice whatsoever but to earn dollars in order to be able to buy goods from abroad, and have to flog everything they've got at very low prices in order to earn dollars. And it gets worse than that, because in the last weeks of March, early week of April, there was a huge crisis. And suddenly, because all the dollars had fled to the US, there was a shortage of dollars in the world, right? Everyone was rushing to New York for safety. And there weren't enough dollars to buy oil or to buy soybeans or to buy copper, right? And so the Fed started to dish out dollars to their friends, essentially, and these are called swap lines. And the deal was, I'll give your central bank some dollars in exchange for some of your euros or Japanese yen or whatever your currency is, and in the future, please pay me back those dollars, right? The problem was that these dollars were only provided, these swap lines were only provided to rich countries, to OECD countries. They were not provided to all the low-income countries. And they weren't provided, of course, to Venezuela, Iran, but also not to China. So this system, you know, which has been, if you like, at the heart of the oil business, it's absolutely fundamental to the oil business, the currency, the dollar and oil. You know, this is at the moment generating enormous geopolitical tensions. It's the kind of thing where actually, you know, you could end up going to war. If you run out of dollars, if you're a country like Turkey or India even, or China run by authoritarian leaders, and you can't get the dollars you need just for the basic functioning of your economy, this can make people feel pretty kind of angry and behave badly and dangerously. So I think my message is that I hope that while you're working and campaigning at the very important level here, you're also thinking systemically, because thinking systemically and talking systemically, talking to your friends and your neighbors and reading the papers and looking at the fantastic web that you've got now, which is an amazing resource, the internet, you can find stuff you could never have found before. Understanding that system and talking about system change, not climate change, for me is a really, really important mission for the People and Planet movement. And I commend you for doing what you do, and I'd love you to do more. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anne. I think what all these interventions have shown is how interconnected our movements are, our economic and political systems are, and the structures that we're fighting. It's not simply a case of some depoliticized climate change that we want to stop. It's not simply the case of climate justice without social justice or without broader shifts in our economy. And that's indeed why we're called People and Planet, because they are one and the same struggle. So going to move on now to the Q&A section of this. Going to ask our speakers to probably limit their responses to 2 or 3 minutes. For those of you in the virtual audience, take a minute or so to think of some questions, and then you can either send them to one of my co-hosts, who should have, you should be able to see in the chat, or send it to everyone and we'll pick them out. In the meantime, though, I'm going to start with a couple of questions individually. I think those interventions really kind of drew out these different connections, and we also need to then think about how we're going to act on those as activists and organisers. So I guess I'll read out the questions, then maybe go to you individually. Adrienne, maybe if you want to talk about the effectiveness of local or localized or specific institutional boycotts of banks like Barclays, and what role they could play in the current moment, particularly given the oil crash that's happened because of coronavirus. And I think maybe talking about this transition towards a kind of post-pandemic, much more progressive economy and society, which people are kind of talking about now, how the pandemic has exposed a lot of the inequalities and how there's real space to fight for progressive change. What role might the financial system play within that? And what would you view the role of grassroots organisers be in fighting for that change? People and Planet as a kind of student activist network. What would the advice that you might give to our movement?
You're speaking to me?
Yes, going to do one of each. I'll ask Kayah, and then go for a round. Then I'll have some questions from the audience as well. Kayah, I'm sure not the only one in reading Our History is the Future, the book by Nick Estes, and talking early on about the leadership that Indigenous women in particular have played and that you've shown tonight. I wonder if you see any kind of gendered element, or what gendered element you see to the frontline response to neocolonial fossil fuel extractivism, and to the attacks on your communities. So if I maybe take that in order and start with you, Adrienne.
Yeah, so I guess we did end up, covering off a decent amount of that between me and Anne, I guess, but I'll sort of run through key points again. So to echo Anne, the work that groups like People and Planet have done in targeting institutions and 350 and the broader divestment campaign has been incredibly valuable in a lot of ways. I think, it's done wonders in stigmatizing, investing in fossil fuels to an extent. And even, I think Shell made a comment the other year that, divestment had a huge material impact on their business and on their ability to get credit, for example, and on the willingness of investors to sort of engage with them. So I think that has been hugely valuable thus far. I do think, as Anne said, we need to also focus systemically and globally. And, following on from this, look beyond just banks, but definitely looking at them, but also looking at public investment, which is a huge guide for what banks invest in as well, and for what, the private system will invest in. And as we come out of this, unprecedented economic downturn, there are massive decisions to be made, particularly with respect to sort of the struggles that the oil industry is seeing on, bailing out those companies, particularly, unconventional oil companies like fracking companies tend to be the most vulnerable. They're already hugely over leveraged prior to this point. So you could see them collapse, or we could see them bailed out, which I think is already happening in a lot of places. So demands to be made would be, for me, shifting to demanding that sort of all public money is focused on sort of rebuilding in a way that is green and that looks to the next, massive crisis that we will face and are already facing, which is a climate emergency. So I think ensuring that, all future money that we're investing, has that in mind, rather than just putting out fires as they come and then bailing out companies, no strings attached, with what I think Donald Trump described as sweetheart conditions, for the American shale industry. Demanding that is not how this goes will be a huge focus for me going forward.
Brilliant, thank you so much. If I can maybe pass over to Anne.
Hi, so I think there are two things. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about Jubilee 2000. So the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which ran from about 94 to 2000, was really a campaign that was incredibly under-resourced, hardly any money at all. And we just slowly built up our support amongst people. And it was just the beginning of the internet, by the way. So we only began to use those resources. The first thing we did, and the most important thing we did, was to educate our supporters. And honestly, I can't tell you, and I had no idea this would happen myself, I can't tell you how empowering it is for people just to understand the system. It just makes such a huge difference. And when the G8 arrived in Birmingham in 1998, Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, there was Yeltsin was there, all the world leaders were there. They were absolutely stunned, and so were we, because 100,000 people turned up to say cancel the debt. And the only thing we'd done was actually inform people, to explain, on A4 sized paper, bullet pointed facts and figures, and we got our analysis and we got our numbers right. We made sure nobody could trip us up with mistakes, really. And once people understood what was going on between international creditors and sovereign debtors, which before everybody said, oh, it was too complicated to explain. It wasn't very complicated, actually. But once they understood, they were empowered to act. And so for me, the most important thing, and I'll never forget, if I could just tell this little anecdote, which I tell everywhere I go, so you may have heard it before, but I'll never forget a Treasury official coming up to me and saying, what the hell is going on? He says, we get letters on pink pieces of paper with bunches of roses in the corner, in which someone says, dear sir, I've been following this very closely, and I understand that you've chosen a cut-off date for Uganda's debt relief, which doesn't reflect blah, blah. He said, who explained to her about Uganda's cut-off date for debt resolution? We said, we did, actually, and it's not rocket science. But, what had happened was that woman was able to sit at her kitchen table and write this letter to the Chancellor and get a reply from the Treasury, because and then she turned up in Birmingham, really, and leaders couldn't believe what had happened. Blair couldn't believe what had happened. He had to fly back into the city on that day to meet us because it was all so embarrassing for him. So I want to say, first of all, education is terribly important. And then I want to say another simple thing is we just got to give up on fossil fuels. You know, we've got to be riding our bicycles. We've got to be going on trains and buses, and we've got to give up cars. And I tell you, that's already having an impact. There's a revolution going on out there. You know, during this 2 weeks, bicycle sales have absolutely soared. People are discovering actually that it's rather nice to be able to go cycling on empty roads. It's good for your health and all of that. So that is happening, and it's happening on the continent perhaps more than it is happening here. But people giving up on cars is going to be incredibly, as far as I know, I've been hearing rumors of huge tankers parked outside harbors in the United States, packed full of cars on the one hand and oil on the other, with nowhere to go. They're not selling cars, of course. Now it's a bizarre moment. It's a really extremely exceptional moment, but nevertheless, you know, there's going to be a plunge in consumption of things like cars and oil. And we've got to be part of that, because actually that's the strongest message you can send to the market. So whatever way you can find of avoiding using fossil fuels, it will have an impact. And it's something very concrete that people can do.
Brilliant. Kayah, can I move to you now? If I unmute and spotlight.
Okay. So as I think I heard you correctly in saying how gender plays a role in a lot of the environmental activism. Is that correct? And okay, this is something I like to talk about frequently because, as I said earlier, there's like an inherent like feminine spirit of our water that we live on, and as we call it, our Mother Earth, it's something very female about it, about the creation of life that it gives. And so when me and my nation are speaking in this movement, we refer to it as Mother Earth or our grandmother inlet. So there's something already very feminine about that energy going on. And there's also this correlation of every time there is destruction and disrespect to the earth, you can see very close by there is high rates of domestic violence, murdered and missing Indigenous women that follow. You see in a lot of man camps, in industrial man camps, that the rates of domestic violence and sexual assault skyrocket. Where industry puts camps of just full of men, you see a lot of women are being abused in those surrounding communities and surrounding areas. So there's this massive correlation of where there's destruction and disrespect to the earth, you see destruction and disrespect to a lot of women. And I also don't think it's a coincidence that every time you see empowerment and feminism, you see this uplift of the environmental movement. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I've been on several panels that lately have been either all female or majority female. And I think it's, as I said earlier, I think it's really cool how it's all three women speaking today. I think that's great. And even for my own nations, they're both majority female. At one point, my father's nation, Tsleil-Waututh, who have been opposing the pipeline for many years, was completely women-led, had a women chief, treasurer, and the entire council was female. So I think on the other side of that, that there's this massive like correlation with female empowerment and environmental uplift. I think there's a lot of patterns we're seeing with the feminist movement and with our environmental movement. And that's something that's a teaching that's been passed on, but it's also something I've been seeing a lot and a lot of actions, a lot of panels, and a lot of movements. So that's my take on feminism and our environmental movement.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We're going to go now for maybe one, or if we have time, two more rounds of kind of questions from the virtual audience. So we won't be able to see you, but you're all very much appreciated. For Adrienne, Dom is asking, how can we demand greater transparency on pensions, especially as funding for fossil fuel companies is a part of that and part of any potential bailouts? George, presaging our later calls to action, asks you, Kayah, what's the #1 piece of advice you'd give to climate activists in the UK to make sure our activism is kind of inclusive in solidarity with Indigenous struggles? And I'm going to give you two, because you're just that impressive. Leon asked what reading you'd recommend for understanding how the international currency system works in more detail. But then I think there's also a question of what might the new normal that we could be demanding now in the wake of the pandemic that the pandemic has kind of caused and opened up, what demands might we be leveraging at that point? And to other audience members, if you put your questions in the chat, either to me or to everyone, we'll try and get around to them. Maybe if I could do it in reverse order. So first, Kayah, then Anne, then Adrienne. Let me know if you need the question repeated.
Okay. I could read it right here. So the #1 piece of advice I'd give to somebody who's trying to stand in solidarity with Indigenous struggles is shine a light on the issues. When every time there's something going on, especially with, there was a lot going on at the BC legislature with Wet'suwet'en, we see you. We see when people across the globe hold up signs or even just voice their solidarity. We see it and we hear it and we talk about it. We're like, people all across the globe are here supporting us. They're here watching Canada commit horrible injustices against Indigenous peoples. And so just shining a light on the struggle, speaking about it, posting about it, holding signs, even if it's just a couple people, like we see it across the globe in BC, anywhere. So my best piece of advice would just be shine a light on the issues. You hear it, talk about it, hold signs. We see you and we hear you and we're so grateful. So just, yeah, that would be my best piece of advice. Just put visibility to the issues.
Thank you so much. Anne, should we pass over to you? You had one on reading on the international monetary system, and then, besides your own works, of course, and another on demands that we could leverage amidst the new normal.
Yeah. So first of all, I think Kayah's, am I on? Yeah. So first of all, I think Kayah's advice is really, really good. It's the shining on the light. The shining of the light on what's going on, exposing this stuff, which is just so important, and we must keep doing that. First of all, on what to read, there's a wonderful book by a man called Eric Helleiner about the evolution of the financial system post-war, and it really, it's a bit dense. It's a sort of academic text, but it's really one of the most important texts on how the financialization of the system took place. And really, I mean, if I could understand it, I can assure you everybody else could understand it. It's a really good book, so I recommend that. On action, I wanted to go back to what Adrienne said about pension funds, because I meant to say this before, actually. She's absolutely right about the risks that pension funds are taking with our savings right now by investing in, for example, oil, right at this moment where it's collapsing. God knows what losses they're accumulating right now. So I think the demand, the ask should be re-nationalize our pensions, end the privatization of pensions, re-nationalize pensions. We want to re-nationalize pensions. I think you'll find that will really shake the system, and it's something that we must demand, because if there were to be a crash of pensions, oh my God, the societal impact of that would be immense. But we've got to be there ahead of the game and call for the nationalisation of pensions. So that's my advice.
Who knows me knows that I am always up for a nationalisation demand, and I've never heard of nationalising pensions before, so we're gonna add it into the mix. Adrienne, do you want to round us off?
Yeah, so I mean, and definitely hit the nail on the head there, which is a huge struggle for this has been privatization of pension funds. It just turns them into sort of more of a black box than they already were. And, you know, private pensions also partly is a result of sort of shifting it from public to private. You know, the wealth in them is hugely unevenly distributed. So there's not a lot of, you know, sway that we can often have because a lot of people aren't represented in those. But Nest, again, I'll turn back to it, is a good example insofar as it's sort of a government-backed scheme set up by the UK government, and therefore is something that should be publicly accountable in a way that maybe private pensions are less so. So it sounds really, you know, simplistic, but something so simple as sort of writing to your Nest representative, writing a letter to a trustee. You can sort of get formalized templates from these from a few campaign organizations, or if you are in a private pension, writing to your trustee, you should be able to access that information and expressing sort of discontent. And, you know, if doing one person writing that letter, you know, it may get lost sort of in the wind, but if you can coordinate people that maybe you work with or that are in your union, and there are enough of you that can sort of collectively express that view, it can be really powerful. And there's a really good group that sort of does help with this called Share Action. And they have a program where they'll come talk to you about your pension and how you can interact with them and demand not only things like that they divest from fossil fuels, but also that they use your money and the stakes they get in companies as a result to push any companies like a steel or a cement company, for example, to have decarbonization targets and to ensure that you know, it's acting sustainably and all of those things. So Share Action would be a good group to contact if you're looking for advice. And just a super long reading, if anyone's interested in pensions, is a really good report on global pension privatization from the ILO and a woman named Isabel Ortiz, which is really, really good. So highly recommend.
That is impressive knowledge, Adrienne. Fantastic. Thank you so much for your interventions. I think we're gonna move on to the last stage of our webinar, which is kind of a mini rally. People have been asking how they can get involved, what kind of different forms of action we can take, and we're going to listen from a few more words from Kayah and a couple of other speakers on action that we're taking. Obviously, People and Planet runs the Diverse Barclays campaign. Adrienne talked about Share Action. Share Action are pushing for a motion at the Barclays annual general meeting this Thursday, which pushes for the most basic of demands, the compliance with the Paris Agreement itself, utterly insufficient, but to tackle the climate crisis. But even this moderate demand that's being pushed by Share Action is being repelled by the bad folk over at Barclays, who are instead kind of lauding this 2050, 30 years away, quasi-genocidal climate target. And that's why we need to keep up the pressure, and we're going to be hearing about that in different ways. On which note, I'm going to pass over to Steph. Steph is one of our student organisers from Loughborough at People and Planet. She's going to talk a little bit about what action she's been taking in the campaign and how you can get involved as well. And thank you so much to all of our speakers. I'm not sure I can clap properly, but I definitely speak for everyone to say I'm much wiser as a result of this. So over to you, Steph. Hope you can unmute yourself.
Yes, I think I can. Hi. Yeah. So firstly, just reiterate that, like, I think I can speak to everyone, that was a brilliant webinar and really amazing talks, and I'm very, very grateful to have the chance to hear from our three fantastic speakers. So yeah, as Angus said, now we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to hear a little bit from a few people about how they've got involved with climate justice, and also how possibly you might be able to get involved as well. So starting with me, I'm Steph. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a student at Loughborough. and a part of the Loughborough People and Planet group there. And we've been going for about 3 years. And we, in our first year, managed to get the university to divest from fossil fuels using a quite dynamic direct action approach. Yeah, we were quite radical. The university by the end of the year was pretty terrified of us, which was quite helpful for future campaigns. And then, yeah, and so a couple of years ago, we started the Divest Barclays campaign here at Loughborough, continuing to use this direct action approach. And we had some really great successes from that. So the university stopped inviting Barclays to their career events, which previously they did every year. They changed their day-to-day bank account from Barclays. They cancelled an annual enterprise event that they do in collaboration with Barclays, which is kind of like one of their flagship events. And I say they cancelled it, actually, our campaign scared Barclays so much that they just didn't come. Well, they stopped speaking to the university, actually. So we've gotten to the point where Barclays are like scared to come on campus, and our university is scared to invite them as well, because they don't know what we're going to do, but they know what will be there. And we've also had our Students' Union cancel an event, a recruitment event with Barclays. And we've also been a pretty big pain in the ass to the Barclays branch in town as well. And I think this, these campaigns that we've been doing kind of demonstrates 3 things that I really believe in for student campaigning, but it may be even like wider for the wider climate movement. And the first is direct action. So we heard some examples earlier, and I think one of my favorite examples of direct action that we did at our university was we have like one of the biggest campuses in Europe, and prospective students came for a campus tour, and it takes about 40 minutes to walk around campus. And we were like 2 minutes ahead of them for the whole time, chalking the path with messages about our campaign, which the university absolutely hated. Another favorite was we dyed our fountain a nice bright orange, which is our trademark color. And we also had like a full out arguments with our chief operating officer at the university in front of everyone at open day, which was pretty great as well. And I really believe in this kind of action, mostly because I think a lot of time it can be fairly impenetrable to get through a lot of the bureaucratic systems to be able to discuss something with management at universities. And when you finally do get to discuss with them, if you politely ask them behind closed doors, it's very easy for them to dismiss you because they can prioritize their political and financial interests over your own student, staff, universal interests. And so doing these very public facing kind of actions makes it very, very hard for them to dismiss you. They just can't ignore you, basically. And we're targeting and sabotaging the things that the university really cares about. So it's its reputation and its sources of income. And I think taking direct action, targeted direct action like this is like really important. I think we are like continuously set limits of acceptable ways to protest, to act, to organize, to fight, to even move by all sorts of powers, be it the state, media, prison system, social forces, or jobs. And it's quite uncomfortable, but I think we do have to push those limits and go beyond those limits to have any chance of moving to a world worth living in. And the second thing is I also really believe in these local level kind of boycotts as an effective way of hurting capitalism and the fossil fuel industry, especially when it's done by institutions like universities, who should be setting an example for the rest of society. And just at a university level, I think it's quite absurd to think about like how students and staff don't have direct democratic control over whether their universities invest in a fossil fuel industry that will kill them. And I think it really demonstrates the need to have our own democratic control over our own working, learning, and living conditions. And the third thing is I really believe in this kind of grassroots organizing as well. So I think change really comes from these kinds of groups. I've kind of seen it myself here at Loughborough, and quite often I found, and I guess it's not always the case, but like people who are in power, you know, only meaningfully act when they're kind of dragged along by these kind of grassroots groups, and most of the time they're actually kind of like spineless zombies that just kind of go with the wind. Obviously that's not always true. There's some great people that run for some positions, which is great. And so I actually wanted to finish with a quote by Deleuze. I don't know how many like rallies you go to where you get to hear a quote from Deleuze, but the rules of real life rallies don't apply here, so you can quote any old philosophers you want. But the quote is, "There's no need to fear or hope, but only to look for new weapons," which I think is quite important at the moment. So I think, yeah, we don't need to search for hope. In fact, like it's you can see it as kind of a distraction from actually the action that we can be taking with our comrades. And we don't need to give power away to some sort of external abstract hope and wait for this change to come, when the power to change comes from all of us, and every worker produces everything that we need. All the things that we value is created by us, and we have so much power in ourselves together, and we need to exercise our power in like clear, certain terms to collectively fight for this world that is worth living in. Yeah, that's pretty much from me. I was gonna pass on now to Kayah, who's gonna talk briefly as well. I don't know, Angus, are you able to spotlight Kayah, or do I need to do that? There you go.
So first of all, I forgot that, but tomorrow is a pretty important day. It's National Awareness Day for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Two-Spirit women. And so if people can put a spotlight and use their platforms to spread awareness on that, that would be great. It's a very important day for me and my family, to bring awareness to how many Indigenous people have gone missing. And again, it goes, as I said earlier, there's this massive correlation with the industry and with man camps and domestic violence and assault of women. So if people could spread awareness on that, that would be great. And I also wanted to share 2 resources. If you want to learn more about, I mentioned earlier how Tsleil-Waututh Nation made a 1,200-page assessment on why they oppose what was once the Kinder Morgan pipeline, now the Trans Mountain pipeline. And if you could go to twnSacredTrust.ca, and if you feel, and another resource is raventrust.com. It's a nonprofit organization that helps raise legal funds for Indigenous nations, taking industry to court, and so they help pay for the legal funds of those battles. And yeah, those are 2 resources that I thought I'd share. Yeah.
Hi, am I back on?
You are back on.
Spotlight now. Excellent, great. Sorry, very new to Zoom. So yeah, thank you very much for that. That's amazing. And now we're going to pass on to Aoife, I believe, to talk a little bit about Diverse Pride.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
So Kayah and Anne have really elegantly pointed out that, you know, the fight against fossil fuels isn't isn't independent of the other structural inequalities that we see in the world, namely the genderedness of the impacts of climate change and the side effects that these industries have where they're located, and also the links to global arms and militarization. And so, in this vein of kind of joining together struggles, the Divest Barclays campaign is launching a summer attack on Barclays sponsors of pride campaigns. So one of the things that Barclays are doing in order to combat the stigma that they acknowledge is being created by our divestment campaigns, they sponsor all kinds of events, including 5 UK Pride festivals this year. And whilst the Pride festivals aren't happening in the same sense as they would in usual years, we are going to be challenging the organisers to rethink taking dirty fossil fuel money from Barclays, and kind of draw on the vibrancy and the history of past and present queer campaigning, and reiterate the point that the queer community are not simply a marketing demographic, that we care about these things, and that we will be on the front lines of climate crises and already are. So if anyone is interested in that, keep an eye out on the People and Planet social media and email list, and we'll be looking for ways to get involved in the next few weeks.
Brilliant, thank you, Eva. And now I think we're going to pass to Angus just to finish us off.
Thank you very much, Steph, and thanks again to all of our speakers. That was really inspirational, really informative, and really educative. And I'm sure we'll be using those lessons in the coming months. Like I said, the Divest Barclays campaign at People and Planet has been running for about 3 years now. During that time, we've taken lots of different forms of action, like the direct action Steph has talked about. We've had students' unions up and down the country voting to boycott Barclays, including the National Union of Students. And we also have a time-honoured tradition, disrupted, let's choose my words carefully, this year, of disrupting the AGM and perhaps in future Pride festivals as well. Those successes, that's led to successes along with our NGO partners and climate campaigners and all those fighting on the front line. That's the front line, including, stopping Barclays from funding fracking in England, forcing Barclays into regulating it, not enough, but regulating a bit. It's kind of coal and tar sands financing, which is obviously particularly relevant today. You can get involved if you're a student at a UK university. You can email fossilfree@peopleandplanet.org. You can go on our website, peopleandplanet.org. We also this year, like I say, have been running lots of different campaigns and now have 50% of UK universities that have divested from fossil fuels. That's been an enormous movement with an enormous victory that's really helped push the tide against fossil fuels and fossil fuel extractivism. So do get involved. At the same time, Adrienne and Anne have talked about lots of different ways we can be pushing on a broader scale, all the different tactics, all the different targets we can be employing in our fight for climate justice. So yeah, basically to round off, thank you very much to all of our inspirational speakers. Thank you to all of you who've joined us, and solidarity for the struggle for climate justice ahead.